You are not aligned with our future, Brooke. That was not the first knife Clint Higgins had twisted during my 5 years at the firm. It was just the first one he decided to say out loud in front of the entire department. But to understand how we got to this point, we have to rewind 5 years to a rainy Tuesday afternoon that smelled like burnt coffee filters and impending corporate collapse. I sat across from the founding partners of our software company, still green, still hopeful, and still naive enough to believe that sweat equity actually meant equality. I had just finished back-to-back presentations and pulled a complete all-nighter formatting the pitch deck they used to land their Series A funding round. Clint was too hungover to show up for the client meeting that morning, but when the founders started clapping at the close of the deal, he materialized in the doorway just in time to accept the praise like a delivery driver, taking credit and tips for food he did not cook. I noticed it then, a toxic pattern that would soon calcify into corporate scripture at our office. Clint wins, you serve. We are a team, he would croon, a smug Silicon Valley smile curling on his face like a cheap sticker peeling off a plastic laptop. But I quickly learned that team in Clint's vocabulary meant you bleed, while I take the brand. Still, I took the job as a senior product designer. I even negotiated quietly behind his back. While Clint was waving his fancy electronic cigarette and bragging about his volatile cryptocurrency portfolio to anyone who would listen, I slipped one critical line into my employment contract, under performance-based incentives. It was a clause most human resource reps missed, a single sentence buried deep in the boilerplate text. Legal approved it with a bored yawn because they never expected a product developer to originate new business. The clause, known as Section 9.2, granted me a 5% commission on any deal directly originated and finalized under my oversight, payable in full within 14 business days of my termination for any reason. I wrote it down, signed the paper, and kept a copy in my files, just in case the corporate winds decided to shift, flash forward through 5 years of brutal launch weeks that bled into exhausted weekends. 5 years of Slack notifications chiming at 2:17 in the morning about urgent slide edits. 5 years of watching Clint roll into major meetings with Red Bull breath and my ideas hot in his mouth. I said absolutely nothing when he used my wireframes in a keynote presentation and called them his own proof of concept. I said nothing when my interface designs won industry awards under his name. I did not even flinch when he stood before the board of directors and declared that his team delivered only because he pushed them past their comfort zones. But I remembered every single slight, and I kept a secure digital folder titled Insurance. Inside were copies of proposals, client communications, draft agreements, and that tiny commission clause circled in bright red ink. I updated that folder like clockwork every quarter, keeping meticulous records of my contributions. By year 5, burnout was no longer just a temporary physical feeling. It was the permanent wallpaper of our office. People quit, got written up, or quietly disappeared under Clint's intense pressure. I stayed, not because I loved the environment, but because I knew exactly how this story was going to end, and then came the lead. It arrived on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, slipped into my inbox like a discarded napkin. The subject line was short, forwarded cold introduction from unknown sender. Clint's note written above it was brief and dismissive. Knock yourself out, superstar. It was his polite translation for go waste your time on a dead end. I clicked on the email thread and realized it was a messy introduction from an assistant to an assistant at a company called Triton Systems. Clint had already labeled them a death spiral vertical in our weekly stand-up meeting. Most of the engineering team had brushed them off as a graveyard of empty buzzwords and half-baked interest. But I did not dismiss them. I set up an initial call, then another, then a casual coffee meeting. I took detailed notes in my tiny leather notebook and saved every single slide deck in my private folder. Triton Systems was not just another minor software vendor. They were massive, operating at a federal government contract level. They had capital, they had complex technical use cases, and most importantly, they had absolutely nobody else courting them yet. I did not tell Clint a single thing about our discussions. Instead, I leaned into the chaos he gave me. He dumped 3 failing launch rollouts on my desk the same week as an intentional smokescreen to keep me occupied. "You are so great at cleaning up my disasters, Brooke," he said, laughing with his mouth half full of a high-protein bar. I smiled back and told him I was happy to help. My nights turned into caffeine-powered marathons, patching code written by junior developers, but my days became a masterclass in quiet diplomacy. I nurtured the Triton Systems lead, talking to operations, then procurement, and finally strategy. I offered mock-ups, honest feedback, and endless patience, and I made sure every invite showed Brooke Dunlap as the originator. Every non-disclosure agreement bore my name. I did not brag to the team, and I did not loop in sales operations. I just built a relationship like a ghost laying bricks no one could see yet. The client was Triton Systems, but I quickly came to think of them as the quiet giant of our industry. Their headquarters were tucked inside a brutalist slab of concrete and badge-access steel, out in the business district of Arlington. They had Department of Defense-level security, military-grade ventilation, and a front desk receptionist who looked like she could disassemble a standard handgun in 30 seconds flat. They did not post job openings on public boards, they did not issue flashy press releases, and they did not even maintain a real corporate profile online. They just had a simple blue and gray placeholder website with a logo that looked like a weather app. But the deeper I went into their operations, the clearer it became. They were the kind of client that could move an entire company's revenue needle for a decade just by whispering yes to a contract. I met their chief procurement director over a cup of black coffee. His name was Frank Alvarez, a retired military logistics specialist, to ask sharp, surgical questions. I answered every single query directly, refusing to oversell our capabilities or posture like a traditional sales representative. I brought diagrams, clear implementation timelines, and honest failure contingencies. I did not use popular buzzwords like synergy or paradigm shift even once. At the close of our second meeting, Frank looked at me and said that they were used to dealing with pushy sales executives, but I was different. I told him that I was not a sales representative, but a builder. He nodded slowly and told me to keep building. From that point forward, I never missed a single beat. Every interaction with Triton Systems was meticulously logged. I did not use the company's shared customer database, where Clint Higgins could easily snoop and attempt to insert himself into the deal. Instead, I built my own encrypted archive on a secure drive. I saved timestamped emails, portable document format files of meeting agendas, and Zoom video transcriptions that listed my name as the meeting host. I used a private digital board to track follow-ups and action items. Every single document I sent to Triton Systems had metadata that listed my initials in the author field. When Frank Alvarez asked for a white paper on system security, I sent him one I had ghostwritten for a vice president the previous quarter, but I quietly revised the author line to reflect my own name. Back at our headquarters, Clint was neck-deep in what he called a cultural realignment campaign. This meant he spent his time hanging new posters in the break room, with slogans like extreme ownership printed in bold, impact fonts. He also created a dedicated communication channel for radical feedback, which quickly devolved into employees passive-aggressively complaining about squeaky office chairs and missing snacks. I did not engage in any of the drama. I kept my head down, working in the quiet spaces between assignments. Nobody asked where I was going when I left the office early on Thursday afternoons. Nobody noticed when I blocked out hours on my calendar as professional training and instead took long calls with Frank Alvarez and his technical team to discuss application interface security frameworks. I spoke their technical language. I did not pitch them a product. I advised them on a solution. I became indispensable to their transition plan, and the more useful I became, the more Triton Systems let me into their inner circle. First, I was introduced to their senior product engineers, then their budget owners, and eventually a director who held signing authority for major acquisitions. Every single time they invited me to a new meeting, I marked the date, the time, and the list of attendees. I maintained a private spreadsheet that was color-coded by department and influence. Green meant technical allies, yellow meant neutral observers, and red represented their legal department. By month 3, we were actively discussing deployment roadmaps and custom integration schedules. Back at our firm, Clint handed me a project board filled with impossible stretch objectives for our existing products. When I pushed back gently and explained the technical limitations, he clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder and told me to slow down. I smiled and told him I would not dream of it. Later that evening, I updated my insurance folder. I added a new subdirectory titled Triton Systems Phase 2. Inside it, I saved a memo of understanding with my name listed as the sender, a comprehensive summary of system requirements, and a non-disclosure agreement signed on official company letterhead. I never forwarded these documents to our sales operations team. I never logged the lead in our shared database. And I never mentioned it to Clint. If anyone in leadership had looked closely at my calendar, they would have noticed entire blocks of time titled Legacy Systems Audit. They would have noticed a pattern of travel and calls that pointed to a massive deal. But Clint had convinced himself that I was just a reliable workhorse, unthreatening and invisible. I let him believe that because invisibility had its distinct advantages, it allowed me to build without political interference, without constant interruptions, and without Clint taking early credit. I was a ghost laying bricks in a wall that Clint did not see coming. And behind that wall, a $24 million deal was quietly taking shape. The intense stretch of work began with a confident smile from Clint. "All right, team," he said, pacing back and forth in front of the glass wall of the conference room like a motivational speaker. "We are going to hit our beta release by March 1st. No exceptions and no excuses." It was January 9th, and every software engineer in the room stared at him like he had just asked them to build a functional rocket ship out of paper clips and unpaid overtime. The project was a clunky, semi-integrated customer feedback dashboard that Clint had already promised to investors as an industry-disrupting tool. In reality, it was still missing core features. Half of the user experience designs had not been approved. Quality assurance had not touched a single line of code, and our lead developer had quietly resigned that morning, citing prolonged psychological erosion. Clint did not even blink. "If you are not dying, you are not trying," he declared, quoting himself from a custom coffee mug he had ordered. "I want fire in your eyes and sweat in your coffee cups." I sat at the far end of the table, my pen motionless, my posture perfect, the absolute embodiment of polite silence. I did not flinch when Clint pointed in my direction and announced that Brooke was going to quarterback the entire release. Everyone in the room groaned internally, but nobody dared to look directly at me. That afternoon, my official project board doubled in size, tasks stacked up like insects in a flood. There were front-end tickets with no specifications and back-end integrations that required 3 separate outside vendors who were not even under contract yet. Clint slapped red priority flags on every item and tagged the entire team in our communication channel. I opened the task list, duplicated it into a separate private folder, and quietly removed my name from everything that was not critical to the core system stability. Then I opened my real project folder for Triton Systems. While Clint chased his ego into another public meltdown, I was in final contract negotiation mode. The quiet giant was ready to sign. Their procurement team had completed their review, their legal counsel had only one minor clause left to approve, and their infrastructure team was already blocking out sandbox server space for our deployment. One of their directors had even asked if I would be available to host a post-signature roadmap session in February. They did not say if anymore. They said when, but I said absolutely nothing to Clint or the other partners. I simply nodded through our daily stand-up meetings, accepted late-night direct messages about broken test environments, and listened to Clint's frantic voice notes where he called me the last adult left in the room. Then, each day after 6 in the evening, when the office noise finally dimmed to a low hiss, I turned off all my notifications, opened my encrypted folder, and got to work. I finalized pricing structures, integration timelines, and licensing frameworks. Every single document was submitted with my digital signature, and every revision featured track changes that pointed straight to my account. I reviewed the technical scopes, cleaned up the delivery timelines, and added professional polish to the final statement of work. It was meticulous, surgical labor, a mosaic of undeniable evidence. I made sure that every file had multiple redundancy copies stored in separate subdirectories of my insurance folder. I knew that in the corporate world, files had a strange habit of disappearing when arguments broke out, so my backup drives were my true armor. I was creating a path that was entirely clear of Clint's influence, establishing a direct connection that Triton Systems valued above all else, somewhere around 1:30 in the morning on a cold Wednesday. I uploaded the final contract draft to Triton's internal portal. At 12 minutes past 7 that same morning, I walked into the office with a large coffee and no complaints. Clint burst out of his corner office with a half-untucked shirt and the manic energy of a manager, high on his own false promises. "We need to cut quality assurance testing and ship a preview to the board of directors this week," he announced. "You are fine with that, right, Brooke?" I looked at him calmly and told him I would make it happen. Then I turned back to my desk, added another critical document to my insurance folder, which was the final pricing sheet in portable document format, and scheduled a final alignment call with Triton's legal team. I did not tell a single soul in the building. By Friday afternoon, the entire development team was on the absolute edge of collapse. Burnout was pouring through the ceiling tiles. One junior developer broke down in tears during our morning stand-up. Another developer openly called Clint a sociopath in our team group chat. Our human resources representative issued a company-wide wellness memo titled "Mental Strength is a Muscle," featuring a stock photo of a woman doing yoga in a messy office. I kept my head down because I was no longer building Clint's fantasy. I was not there to keep his startup dream alive. I was carving out the final inches of something real. Every time I looked at that $24 million contract with my name etched in the deal originator field, I reminded myself that Clint did not know it yet, but he had just made me a very wealthy woman. He thought he was overworking me, but he did not realize I was quietly outgrowing him, and the clock was about to run out. The invite arrived in my inbox at exactly 8:43 in the morning. It was a calendar invitation titled "All Hands Meeting, Urgent and Mandatory Attendance." Clint Higgins had even added a red lightning bolt emoji to the title, as if we were about to be blessed by divine intervention, instead of dragged into another one of his ego-boosting ambushes. There was no agenda attached, just his usual bold formatting and the suspicious urgency of a supervisor about to take credit for a miracle he did not understand. By 9 in the morning, the entire team was packed into the fourth-floor conference room. Half of the developers were still blinking sleep from their eyes, while the other half looked like they were mourning a lost relative. The stench of burnout was so thick you could almost touch it. Clint strolled into the room with a fresh haircut and his designer shirt unbuttoned one level too low. It was his signature victory look. "Big news, everyone," he began, clapping his hands together. "We have secured a massive breakthrough with a strategic partner. I have been in back-channel conversations for weeks. Very tight-lipped stuff, extremely hush-hush." I froze with my coffee cup halfway to my mouth. I watched as Clint clicked the remote control and a slide flashed onto the screen. Triton Systems Strategic Deployment Partnership. The slide featured their logo, my presentation deck, and my scope document, cropped and rebranded with his name. The metadata had been stripped and my fingerprints had been scrubbed from the slides. Clint smiled his slick, wine-tasting smile. "This partner is going to change our entire game," he declared. "Custom deployment capabilities, enterprise-grade scalability, and fully modular infrastructure. It is basically the future of our firm." I looked around the room and saw the exhausted faces of my colleagues. They were nodding along, too tired to question the timeline or how Clint had magically pulled this massive relationship out of his hat. They did not know the details, but they knew Clint's habit of claiming other people's victories. Chad Miller was already whispering to a junior developer, likely planning how he could insert himself into the project team to ride Clint's coattails to a promotion. There it was. My months of intense, quiet labor reduced to bullet points on his PowerPoint presentation. Clint did not flinch, and he did not even glance in my direction. The entire room clapped like they had just watched a trained animal perform. I sat perfectly still, my hand resting on my leather notebook. In my head, a single phrase repeated on loop. "You stupid man. You really think you can eat the fruit and bury the tree?" Clint paced a few more laps around the presentation screen, opening the floor for alignment questions that nobody dared to ask. Someone in the back whispered, asking when this deal had initiated. Clint shrugged off the question, claiming it was just behind-the-scenes hustle, the usual way he operated. I did not say a single word. I just nodded along with the rest of them, jotted down a fake note in my book, and smiled. On the way out of the conference room, Clint clapped me on the back and told me he knew I would come through under pressure. I looked at him and did not blink. That afternoon, I returned to my desk, opened the folder labeled Triton Systems Signature Packet, and quietly forwarded the entire contract execution log to our legal department. The subject line of the email was simple: Record-keeping deal originator, Brooke Dunlap. I attached the complete email chain with Frank Alvarez, the original non-disclosure agreement timestamped 6 months prior, and the digital signature log from Triton's document signing portal. Every field was initialed, every clause was reviewed, and my name was written on every single document. Then I locked my computer, walked down the hall to the Human Resources Department, and requested a printed copy of my original employment contract. The representative asked if everything was okay, and I told her it was just a routine personal review. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in the empty break room, flipping through the pages of my contract. My eyes scanned the fine print until my fingers slid across section 9.2, the commission clause I had negotiated 5 years ago. It was still there, buried in the sea of legal boilerplate. Employees shall be entitled to a 5% commission on any deal directly originated and finalized under the employee's oversight, payable in full within 14 business days of termination for any reason. It was still valid, still binding, and still mine. I folded the page, slid it into my bag, and walked back to my desk as the sun began to dip behind the city skyline. Back at my workstation, our communication channels were flooded with congratulations. Chad Miller had already posted a team selfie captioned, "Big moves with the big dogs, strategy, speed, and success." My name was not mentioned anywhere in the thread, but my private inbox buzzed with a message from Frank Alvarez at Triton Systems. He asked if the contract handoff had gone smoothly, noting they were excited to build the project with me. I replied that everything was received and we would make it count. Then I muted the congratulations channel, updated my insurance folder with the finalized agreement, and closed my laptop. A strange, calm silence settled over me. Clint had just fired the starting gun, and he had no idea he was the target. The final blow arrived on a Thursday morning. Clint Higgins had scheduled another mandatory meeting, this one titled Strategic Realignment Session. When I walked into the glass conference room, the scent of fresh floor cleaner and silent dread was thick in the air. A fruit tray sat sweating under the fluorescent lights next to a box of untouched muffins. Clint strutted into the room wearing a blazer over a t-shirt that said Build, Disrupt, Repeat. "Today is about vision," he began, his eyes scanning the room. "It is about recalibrating toward our core values, trimming the fat, and focusing on what truly matters." I sit quietly in my chair, my hands folded. Clint launched into a presentation about our high burn rate, placing slides on the screen filled with terms like resource misallocation and unexpected overhead bloating. Then came the pivot. "Which brings me," Clint said, locking his eyes onto mine, "to leadership accountability." He clicked to a slide labeled Realigning Key Roles. "Effective today, we are parting ways with Brooke Dunlap. We thank her for her contributions. There was no warning and no prior review. It was a public termination served cold." Gasps rippled through the room. A junior developer dropped his pen, while Toby Jenkins stared into his coffee cup in shock. Clint added that some of the oversight issues in the previous quarter's budget came from mismanagement within product operations, and that the company could not afford to carry legacy inefficiencies. He had just labeled me dead weight in front of my entire team and the human resources representatives, who were waiting near the door. But I did not flinch. Inside, I felt a cold, beautiful clarity. I stood up, packed my notebook, and walked out of the room without saying a word. Clint chuckled behind my back and told the room that I was not aligned with our future. I went straight to my desk, packed my personal items, and saved the final Triton files onto my encrypted drive. I composed a single email to our legal department with one sentence and my contract attached. The subject line was, Section 9.2 Commission upon Termination. I hit send, shut my laptop, and walked out of the building, My attorney, Evelyn Ward, handled the next step. She sent a formal demand letter directly to our legal director, Valerie Thorne. The email contained my complete Triton Systems documentation, 36 client emails, 14 call logs, 5 white papers, the signed non-disclosure agreement, and the final contract showing a value of $24 million. At the bottom was an invoice for $1,200,000, representing my 5% commission, due within 14 business days. Evelyn's letter explained the legal doctrines backing our demand. First, she cited the procuring cause doctrine, a well-established principle in contract law, stating that an employee who initiates and sets in motion a chain of events that directly results in a transaction is entitled to the commission, even if they are terminated before the contract is finalized. Under the procuring cause doctrine, she explained that a company cannot simply reap benefits of an employee's labor and then fire them right before the payout to avoid their obligations. The law protects the originator of the deal, ensuring that the person who did the actual work is the one who gets compensated. Second, she cited the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, which exists in every employment agreement. By terminating me immediately after I had brought in the company's largest deal, specifically to avoid paying the commission, the company had acted in bad faith, making them liable for the full amount and potential damages. By 4 in the afternoon, the company's executive floor was in a state of complete panic. Valerie Thorne called Clint into a meeting with our board directors, Roger Dunaway and Brenda Geller. Valerie projected my documentation on the screen, showing the 36 calendar invites I had hosted and the Zoom recording where Frank Alvarez stated that the Triton deal would not exist without Brooke. Clint tried to claim he had initiated the deal, but he had 0 records to back up his lies. Valerie corrected him, pointing out that my documentation was ironclad and that my contract clause did not require a formal sales title, only that the deal was originated under my oversight. The board faced a simple choice: pay the $1,200,000 immediately, or face a public lawsuit that would destroy their client trust and cost them $79 million in market value. Roger Dunaway called me the next morning to offer a settlement. He tried to demand a standard non-disclosure agreement, but I refused. I told him I wanted the check with no gag order, and that the 14-day window was now a 4-day window for a direct wire transfer. The board capitulated. On Monday morning, a notification slid onto my phone screen. Wire transfer credit of $1,200,000 from Apex Holdings. I did not celebrate outwardly. I just let the calm silence settle. Meanwhile, Clint's world fell apart in spectacular fashion. The board froze his entire discretionary budget, canceled his fourth-quarter incentives, and placed him under an intensive internal compliance review to investigate how he had managed to expose the firm to such massive legal liability. They were searching for any other hidden liabilities he might have created. I sat at a local cafe, sipping a cold Vietnamese iced coffee with condensed milk, feeling the warm sun on my face. My phone buzzed with a message from Toby Jenkins, who wrote that I was an absolute legend. I smiled, put the phone down, and watched the city move. Corporate arrogance is always eventually very expensive, and I had just closed the deal.